I didn't know a phone on a dinner table could make my entire body go cold. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a fight, it wasn't even something dramatic at first glance. It was just my sister-in-law's phone, face down, placed neatly between the salt shaker and her water glass. We were halfway through dinner at my in-laws' house, one of those routine Sunday meals we'd attended so many times I could practically recite the conversation before it happened. My mother-in-law's roast chicken, my father-in-law quietly chewing, my husband talking about work. And then Blake stopped mid-sentence. He froze, his eyes narrowed, his fork hovered in the air. Without a word, he reached across the table and picked up Melinda's phone. "Why is this recording us?" he asked. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, thick, suffocating. I felt it before I fully understood what he meant. A strange pressure behind my eyes, a slow, crawling awareness that something was deeply wrong. Barbara laughed, actually laughed. She waved her hand like Blake had just told a bad joke. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said. "Melinda wouldn't do something like that." But the screen was lit, unlocked, the red recording symbol pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Melinda snatched the phone back. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny it. She looked straight at Blake and said calmly, chillingly, "It's for psychological research, and I'll continue recording." Then she placed the phone back on the table. Face up this time, recording still running. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Because it wasn't just weird anymore. It wasn't awkward. It felt intentional. Threatening. I sat there, edible fully kicked in, hyper-aware of everything. The scrape of silverware, the way Barbara kept chewing like nothing had happened, the way Richard stared at his plate as if it might save him from acknowledging reality. Blake was furious. His voice rose. He demanded she stop. And his parents did nothing. They talked about the weather, about the chicken being dry, about absolutely anything except the fact that their daughter was secretly recording our private conversation. That night, as we left early and drove home in tense silence, one thought kept repeating in my head. If she's willing to record us at the dinner table, what else has she already taken without us knowing? And that was only the beginning. If you'd asked me 3 years ago what scared me most about marriage, I would have said betrayal. Not cheating. At least not first. I mean the quieter kind of betrayal. The kind that happens when you realize the person you're married to is still living inside a family system that will never make room for you. Blake and I met in the most unromantic way possible, at a friend's game night where I showed up late, still in work clothes, hair half pinned, carrying a salad I'd bought at the last minute because I didn't want to arrive empty-handed. Blake was already there, sitting on the floor with a controller in his hands like he was 12, laughing too loud. When I sat down, he immediately offered me the good cushion. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't movie spark, it was ease. He asked me what I did. I told him I worked hard and I liked my peace. He said, "Same." Then he asked if I wanted water, like my comfort mattered more than impressing me. That's what I fell for. We dated for 2 years before we got married. In that time, I learned that Blake wasn't just kind. He was responsible. The kind of man who would stop by a store after a long shift just to grab the exact tea I liked because he'd noticed I was running out. The kind of man who didn't weaponize silence, didn't play games, didn't punish you for having feelings. But I also learned something else. Blake's family was a landscape you had to cross carefully. Barbara, his mother, ran the house like an invisible monarchy. She didn't shout. She didn't explode. Her power was subtler than that. It lived in sighs, in little smiles that weren't smiles, in, "I'm only saying this because I care." Richard, his dad, was physically present but emotionally absent in conflict. He had mastered the art of not taking sides by pretending there was no side to take. If voices rose, he would suddenly become fascinated by the gravy, or remember an errand, or offer to refill drinks. And then there was Melinda. Same age as me. Pretty. Social. Smart in that sharp-edged way that made conversations feel like tests you didn't know you were taking. Blake called her complicated. Everyone else called her misunderstood. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down, quick, casual, like she wasn't doing it on purpose, and said, "Oh, you're cute. Blake usually likes intense women." It was said like a joke, but it didn't feel like one. Back then I tried. I really did. I've always been someone who believes relationships can be built if you show up consistently. So I showed up. I smiled at dinners. I brought dessert. I asked Barbara about her recipes and listened to her stories twice because she repeated them like she wanted to see if you'd stay polite. And because I get anxious in rooms where I feel evaluated, I developed a coping habit, occasionally taking an edible before these dinners. Not to get high and silly, more like to soften the edges, to stop my brain from overanalyzing every pause, every glance, every loaded comment. Ironically, it didn't make me less aware. It made me more aware. Sounds got clearer. Patterns got sharper. I noticed when Melinda interrupted me, not once, but repeatedly. I noticed when she accidentally bumped into me and my drink sloshed over my sleeve. I noticed how she always had something to say about our house, our careers, our choices. And Blake noticed too. The difference was Blake would react. He would say, "That's not okay." He would ask for basic respect. And every single time, the family script kicked in. Barbara would defend Melinda instantly. No pause, no curiosity, no accountability. Richard would retreat into silence, and somehow, Blake would end up being framed as the one making drama. It didn't happen overnight, that slow tightening of my chest before every Sunday dinner. It built over time, like a bruise you keep pressing. Little incidents, little boundary crossings. Melinda showing up unannounced at our house. Melinda borrowing things without asking. Melinda sharing private information like it was casual conversation. And the purse incident. I still remember how exposed I felt when I realized she'd been in my bag, my wallet, my personal items, my space, while I was helping Barbara in the kitchen. When Blake confronted his mom about it, Barbara didn't even look surprised. She looked irritated, as if the real offense wasn't what Melinda had done, but that we had dared to say it out loud. That was the pattern, over and over. So by the time we walked into that Sunday dinner, the one with the roast chicken and the phone on the table, I wasn't walking in blind. I was walking in with years of quiet tension in my body. And still, I wasn't prepared for how far Melinda was willing to go. Looking back now, the recording at the dinner table didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the first time Melinda stopped pretending. Before that night, there had always been a thin layer of plausible deniability. A laugh, a shrug, "you're too sensitive" safety net that Barbara wrapped around her like armor. Melinda could cross a line, and if you reacted, the problem wasn't her behavior. It was your reaction. That pattern had trained all of us to second-guess our instincts. Especially me. I started noticing how Melinda asked questions, not like someone making conversation, but like someone setting traps. She would lean forward slightly, eyes sharp, voice light. "So," she'd say, cutting her meat slowly, "how are things really going at Blake's work?" Or, "Have you two decided what you're doing financially next year, with the economy being what it is?" The questions always sounded casual, but they weren't neutral. They were designed to provoke, to extract, to collect. That night, before Blake noticed the phone, she'd been steering the conversation toward politics, immigration, social issues, the kind of topics that could easily turn ugly if someone wasn't careful. Barbara and Richard held views that hadn't aged well, and Melinda knew it. I remember feeling a strange tension in my chest as she kept pushing. She wasn't arguing, she wasn't disagreeing, she was baiting. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking it, that the edible was making me paranoid, that surely no one would deliberately record their own family at dinner. But once the truth was exposed, all those moments replayed themselves differently. The way Melinda's phone had been placed so carefully, the way she didn't flinch when Blake confronted her, the way she didn't even try to lie. What chilled me most wasn't the recording itself. It was her confidence, as if she'd never expected consequences. After we left that night, Blake was shaking with anger. He gripped the steering wheel too tightly, jaw clenched, replaying the scene out loud, like he needed to hear it again to believe it had happened. "They just ignored it," he said. "They acted like it was normal." I stared out the window, city lights blurring, my thoughts tumbling over each other. Because for Melinda, it was normal. She'd told us stories before, bragging, almost, about collecting dirt on coworkers, about knowing things that gave her leverage. She'd laughed when she said it, like it made her clever instead of cruel. At the time, I dismissed it as exaggeration, dark humor, someone trying too hard to sound powerful. Now I wasn't so sure. The next day, when Blake called his mother to talk about what happened, I listened from the kitchen. I didn't need to hear Barbara's voice to know what she was saying. Blake's face told me everything. He kept repeating, "That's not the point, and it doesn't matter what her intentions were." When he hung up, he exhaled sharply. "She thinks we're overreacting," he said. She actually laughed. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because it wasn't just about Melinda anymore. It was about the system protecting her. Barbara dismissed the illegality of recording without consent like it was a technicality. Richard stayed quiet, as usual. No one asked how we felt. No one acknowledged the violation. And then the memories stacked up. Melinda accidentally spilling drinks on me. Melinda sharing private details with extended family, Melinda showing up unannounced despite clear boundaries. Each incident on its own could be brushed aside. Together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. What scared me most was realizing how much of our private life Melinda had already been exposed to. Blake and I had talked openly at that table about work stress, about money, about personal decisions. If she'd recorded that night, how many other nights had she recorded before? Had she taken photos before? Had she shared them? Stored them? And if she was willing to violate boundaries so openly, right in front of us, what was she capable of doing in secret? When Blake suggested taking a break from family dinners, I felt relief, followed immediately by dread, because I knew how this would be framed. Barbara would blame me. She always did. And I could already feel the weight of it, the familiar narrative forming, the one where I was the outsider, disrupting family harmony, simply by refusing to be mistreated. Still, for the first time, Blake and I were aligned in something crucial. We didn't feel safe. And that realization, once planted, refused to stay quiet. The night Melinda recorded us wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a rupture. Up until that point, every boundary violation had lived in a gray area, annoying, invasive, inappropriate, but still deniable. There had always been room for Barbara to say you misunderstood, for Richard to stay silent, for Melinda to smirk and move on. This time there was no ambiguity. She had recorded us, on purpose, without consent, and she wasn't ashamed. The next morning, Blake and I sat at our kitchen table in near silence, coffee growing cold between us. Neither of us had slept well. My head felt heavy, my chest tight, like my body had been bracing for something it didn't yet know how to name. Blake finally broke the quiet. "I can't pretend that didn't happen," he said. "I just can't." I nodded. My throat felt too tight to speak. What haunted me wasn't just the act itself. It was the way Melinda had doubled down. The way she'd looked Blake in the eye and calmly announced she would continue recording. That wasn't impulsive. That wasn't anxiety. That was control. Later that day, Blake called his mother again. This time he was calmer, measured, deliberate, trying to approach the situation like an adult conversation instead of a confrontation. He explained why the recording was a violation. He explained that in our state, it was illegal. He explained that we no longer felt comfortable being around Melinda. Barbara laughed again. Not cruelly, not loudly, dismissively. She told Blake he was being dramatic, that Melinda would never do anything harmful with a recording, that we were reading too much into it. When Blake brought up Melinda's history, her bragging about blackmail, her pattern of invasive behavior, Barbara brushed it aside. "That's just how she is," she said. That sentence landed like a slap. "That's just how she is," as if that absolved everything. After the call ended, Blake dropped his phone onto the table and rubbed his face with both hands. "She doesn't hear me," he said quietly. "She never does." And that's when the fear settled in. Because if Barbara couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge this line being crossed, then there was no limit to what Melinda could do next. We spent the rest of the day talking things through, slowly, carefully, like people trying to navigate a minefield without triggering another explosion. We listed incidents, patterns, moments we'd ignored or excused. The more we talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated event. It was escalation. Melinda had always tested boundaries. Now she was erasing them. By that evening, we made a decision. We would stop attending family dinners where Melinda was present. Not forever, at least not yet. But for now, we needed space, safety, control. Blake texted his father, Richard, because experience had taught us that Barbara would twist anything said in the heat of the moment. His message was calm, direct. He explained what happened. He explained how it made us feel. He explained that we needed distance. Richard's reply came hours later. "We'll be here when you're ready to come back." No apology, no concern, no acknowledgement of the recording. Just a quiet implication that we were the ones stepping out of line. That was the moment I understood something important. This family didn't see Melinda's behavior as a problem. They saw our boundaries as the problem. And I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever came next wouldn't be small. Because people who are used to being enabled don't respond well when the system protecting them starts to crack. They escalate. And Melinda was already watching. For the first few days after we decided to stop attending family dinners, I lived in a strange in-between state. On the surface, nothing had changed. Blake went to work. I went to work. We cooked dinner, watched TV, went to bed. But inside me, everything was buzzing, like my nervous system had been left switched on. I replayed the dinner over and over in my head. The way Melinda's voice hadn't wavered. The way Barbara had laughed. The way Richard had stared at his plate like silence could protect everyone. And then, inevitably, I started questioning myself. Was it really that bad? Were we overreacting? Had the edible made me misread the situation? That doubt didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of subtle conditioning. From being told, directly or indirectly, that discomfort was my problem to manage, not something others needed to fix. Blake noticed it before I fully admitted it to myself. One night, as we were brushing our teeth, he caught my eye in the mirror. "You're shrinking again," he said softly. I froze. "What do you mean?" He turned toward me, toothbrush still in hand. "You do this when you're about to take the blame for something that isn't yours." I felt my chest tighten. "I just don't want to be the reason your family falls apart," I said. The words came out smaller than I intended. Blake rinsed his mouth, set the toothbrush down, and took my hands. "They're not falling apart," he said. "They're refusing to change. That's not on you." Still, the fear lingered. I knew Barbara's pattern. She wouldn't confront us directly, not at first. She'd plant seeds, suggest concern, call Blake's choices sad or confusing. And eventually, the narrative would surface. I was the influence. I was the wedge. That fear wasn't abstract. Barbara had done something similar before, when I cut contact with my own parents years ago because of emotional abuse. Instead of respecting that boundary, she'd gone behind my back and contacted my estranged mother, claiming she was just trying to help. I'd never forgotten that violation. So when Blake suggested we might need to have a conversation with his parents, clear, calm, final, I felt my stomach drop. "I don't think talking to Barbara will help," I said carefully. "She doesn't listen. She reframes." Blake nodded. "I know. But I don't want to just disappear without explaining ourselves." That's when we started discussing how to respond, not just what we felt. Do we call? Text? Meet in person? Each option felt like walking into a trap. A phone call could be twisted later. A text could be dismissed or shown to others out of context. An in-person conversation would likely turn into gaslighting the moment Barbara felt challenged. Meanwhile, Melinda stayed silent. That silence was its own kind of pressure. It felt strategic, like she was waiting to see how we'd move. The thought that kept returning, quiet but persistent, was this. If she recorded us once, what stops her from doing it again? Or worse, what if she already had? I found myself censoring my own conversations, even in our own home, lowering my voice, pausing before speaking freely. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. That was when I realized the real damage. Melinda hadn't just violated our privacy. She'd injected fear into our sense of safety. One evening, Blake floated an idea. "What if we host gatherings at our place instead?" he asked. "That way we control the environment." I wanted to believe that would help, but my instinct screamed otherwise. "I don't trust her," I said. "Not in someone else's house, not in ours." Because Melinda didn't need a dining table to invade privacy. She only needed opportunity. And history had taught me that direct confrontation with her didn't work. When I'd tried to address issues one-on-one before, she'd either ignored me or twisted my words when reporting back to Barbara. Communication with her wasn't communication. It was ammunition. By the end of that week, Blake and I reached a quiet agreement. We wouldn't explain ourselves again. We wouldn't debate whether our feelings were valid. We would step back. Not as punishment, not as drama, but as protection. Still, even as we made that choice, a part of me braced for backlash. Because families that thrive on denial don't take boundaries lightly. They test them. And I had a sinking feeling that Melinda wasn't finished yet. The distance didn't calm things down. It sharpened them. At first, the silence from Blake's parents felt almost polite. A few days passed. Then a week. No Sunday dinner invitations. No group messages. No passive-aggressive check-ins disguised as concern. And then the stories started reaching us, indirectly. Richard mentioned, casually, that Melinda had been having a hard time lately. Barbara told a relative that Blake was pulling away, and she didn't understand why. Someone else hinted that I was sensitive and misreading things. The narrative was forming without us in the room. What escalated everything wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was the accumulation of contradictions. About 3 months after the recording incident, Richard let something slip during a phone call with Blake. He said Melinda had changed her explanation for the recording, again. First, it had been psychological research. Then it was a class project. Then she claimed the app opened accidentally. Then she said she needed proof because Blake and I twisted her words. Each version contradicted the last. When Blake pointed this out to his father, Richard went quiet. Then he admitted, hesitantly, that even he didn't know what the truth was anymore. That was the first crack. Still, Blake and I tried to find a compromise. We told Barbara and Richard we were willing to attend major holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, only if Melinda wouldn't be there. I expected resistance. Instead, Barbara agreed. Thanksgiving passed quietly, then Christmas. And something unsettling happened. Without Melinda present, the dinners were normal. Barbara was calmer. Richard spoke more. Blake laughed. It was like removing one volatile element had stabilized the entire environment. Barbara even admitted, indirectly, that things were less complicated without Melinda around. Not an apology, not accountability, but an admission. That was when I realized something important. Barbara knew there was a problem. She just refused to name it. Then, just when I allowed myself a sliver of cautious optimism, Melinda re-entered the picture. Richard called Blake in late January. He said Melinda was doing better, that she'd started seeing a real therapist, that she was more stable, less confrontational. He asked if we'd consider one dinner. Blake and I talked for hours. We were skeptical, but we didn't want to be accused of refusing reconciliation if genuine change was possible. So we agreed to one dinner, one chance, with clear boundaries. That dinner was tense, but uneventful. Melinda was quieter. Her phone stayed in her purse. She asked neutral questions. No jabs, no baiting. I left that night exhausted but cautiously hopeful. 2 days later, we were back at Blake's parents' house, helping Richard set up his new computer. Melinda was there too, supposedly just picking up some books. Blake was in the office with his dad when I walked through the living room. That's when I saw it. Melinda was sitting on the couch, phone in hand. On her screen was a photo of me. Not a selfie, not a pose shot. A candid photo. Me, standing in Barbara's kitchen, wearing the same clothes I'd worn at the dinner 2 nights before. She was typing something beneath it. My stomach dropped. "What are you doing with my picture?" I asked. She didn't look up. She stood, walked past me, and left the room without a word. I didn't hesitate. I found Blake immediately and told him what I'd seen. His face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. He wanted to confront her right then, but his brother Mark was visiting from overseas with his girlfriend. Blake hadn't seen him in almost a year. We made the painful decision not to blow everything up during that brief visit. Melinda left shortly after anyway. The moment she was gone, the atmosphere shifted. Again. Lighter. Easier. Mark laughed. Richard relaxed. On the drive home, Blake and I didn't speak for a long time. Then he said it. "She hasn't changed. She's just hiding it better." That was the escalation point. Because now there was proof. Not speculation, not interpretation. She was still collecting, still documenting, still crossing lines. And if she was doing this openly, knowing we were wary, what was she doing when no one was watching? We reinstated no contact with Melinda immediately. Blake told his parents we would not be around her again. Richard sounded tired, defeated. Barbara was furious. She accused Blake of tearing the family apart, of choosing me over blood, of being unforgiving. The familiar script turned up louder. But this time, something inside Blake shifted. He didn't argue, he didn't explain. He ended the call. And for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look conflicted. He looked resolved. The quiet after we cut contact with Melinda wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It settled into our home like a fog, thick with unanswered questions and the kind of fear that doesn't scream, but hums constantly in the background. I started sleeping lightly. Any small sound at night, a car door closing outside, footsteps on the sidewalk, pulled me awake. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering what Melinda knew, what she had saved, what version of our lives might already exist somewhere outside our control. Blake noticed before I admitted it. "You're on edge," he said one evening as I flinched when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. "I'm fine," I lied, too quickly. The truth was harder to say out loud. I felt exposed, not just because of the recording or the photo, but because Melinda had shown us she didn't respect the most basic boundary, consent. And once that line is crossed, there's no clear map for where the next violation might land. At work, I caught myself scanning rooms, lowering my voice in conversations that had nothing to do with Blake's family. My body had learned a lesson my mind was still resisting. Information isn't safe. The emotional weight started bleeding into Blake, too. He loved his parents, despite everything. And cutting contact, even selectively, hurt more than he wanted to admit. I could see it in the way he paused before answering calls from unknown numbers, in the way he stared at his phone after ignoring texts from Barbara. One night after dinner, he finally said it. "What if this is it?" he asked quietly. "What if this is the point where I lose them?" I sat beside him on the couch, the glow of the TV reflecting off his face, and felt my chest tighten. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your family," I said. Again. He looked at me then, really looked at me. You're not, he said. They're making choices, just like we are. I wanted to believe that, but the doubt crept in anyway. Because Barbara's voice echoed in my head, accusatory, disappointed, certain. You're pulling him away, you're overreacting. Families forgive. What if everyone else believed her? What if one day Blake woke up and decided the cost of standing with me was too high? That fear was my lowest point. Not anger, not rage. Fear. Then came the call from Alicia, Blake's cousin. She was crying when Blake answered, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Melinda had offered to help her gather evidence against an ex-boyfriend. What she actually produced was something far darker: screenshots, private messages, photos taken without consent. Information Alicia hadn't asked for and didn't know how Melinda could have legally obtained. A dossier. The word made my stomach turn. It confirmed everything we'd feared. Melinda hadn't stopped. She'd just redirected. When Blake hung up, the room felt smaller, airless. This is who she is, he said finally, and they still won't stop her. That night, we sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, staring at nothing. I felt exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. We had tried everything: direct conversation, compromise, distance, even structured therapy. Nothing stuck. And that's when the grief hit. Not for Melinda, not even for Barbara, but for the family Blake should have had. For the version of holidays and milestones that would always come with conditions, with tension, with vigilance. I cried that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly into Blake's shoulder. I don't want to live like this, I whispered, always waiting for the next thing. Blake held me tighter than he ever had. Then we won't, he said. And in that moment, at our emotional lowest, I realized something painful but freeing. We couldn't save this family. We could only save ourselves. The turning point didn't arrive with a confrontation. It came quietly, through honesty that could no longer be ignored. A few weeks after Alicia's call, Richard asked Blake to meet him for lunch. Alone. He didn't explain why, only said he needed to talk without distractions. When Blake came home that afternoon, his face looked different. Lighter, heavier, both at once. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You were right, about all of it." That lunch, it turned out, had changed everything. Without Barbara present to intercept, soften, or redirect the conversation, Richard had finally spoken plainly. He admitted that he and Barbara had known for years that Melinda struggled, not just with anxiety or depression, but with obsessive patterns that went far beyond social awkwardness. They'd chosen protection over intervention. Richard confessed that Melinda had been collecting information on people since childhood. Notes, observations, patterns, she called them. Barbara had dismissed it as intelligence, curiosity, even maturity. The truth was harder. They were afraid that acknowledging the severity of Melinda's behavior would mean admitting they'd failed her, and so they excused it. That lunch was the first time Richard admitted that silence had been a choice. And it broke him. He told Blake he'd started therapy, that he was finally questioning the family roles he'd played for decades: the peacemaker, the minimizer, the man who avoided conflict at all costs, even when conflict was necessary. "I didn't protect you," Richard had said. "I protected the illusion." For the first time, someone from that family wasn't asking us to shrink. They were acknowledging reality. Shortly after that, Melinda reached out. Not to me, but to Blake. An email, carefully written, polished, almost clinical. She didn't apologize, not directly, but she acknowledged that her actions had created discomfort, and that she was working on understanding appropriate boundaries. She asked if we would meet with her therapist present. Everything in me resisted the idea. But Blake looked at me and said, "I think we need to hear this once, for closure, not reconciliation." So we agreed. The therapist's office was neutral, safe, structured. Dr. Winters explained that Melinda had been diagnosed with OCD and social anxiety, that her information gathering wasn't about malice, but about control, about reducing uncertainty in social situations. Melinda spoke very little. When she did, it sounded rehearsed. "I understand my behavior was inappropriate," she said. "I am committed to changing." No excuses, no theatrics. Just words. Dr. Winters proposed a plan: gradual reintroduction, clear rules, immediate consequences for violations. We left that session cautiously hopeful, but not convinced. Trust doesn't rebuild in an hour. Over the next few months, we tested the boundaries. One dinner, then another. Melinda complied, on the surface. No phone, no photos, no obvious violations. But something about it felt hollow. And then Alicia called again. Melinda had stopped therapy. Barbara had encouraged it. and Melinda was back to collecting, only more covertly. That was the final clarity. The pattern hadn't changed. The environment had. And without accountability, it always would revert. The turning point wasn't just realizing Melinda wouldn't change. It was realizing we didn't need her to. We stopped hoping, stopped explaining, stopped waiting for permission to protect ourselves. Blake told his parents, calmly, firmly, that we were stepping back permanently from any relationship that included Melinda. No ultimatums, no drama. Just reality. And for the first time, the power shifted. Not because we won, but because we chose ourselves. The fallout didn't explode. It fractured. Slowly, quietly, in ways that couldn't be undone. Once Blake made it clear that we were stepping back permanently from any relationship involving Melinda, the family system reacted exactly as it always had. Only this time, there was no one left willing to absorb the shock. Barbara doubled down. She accused Blake of abandoning his responsibilities as a son. She told extended family members that he was being manipulated, that I was controlling, that our boundaries were cruel and unnecessary. She framed herself as the wounded matriarch, trying to hold a broken family together. But something was different now. Richard wasn't shielding her anymore. A few months later, he called Blake with news neither of us expected. He had moved out. Not temporarily, not to cool off. He had packed a bag and rented a small apartment near his office. The reason came out in pieces. Hesitant at first, then undeniable. Richard had discovered spyware on his and Barbara's computers. Software that tracked emails, financial data, browsing history. Melinda had installed it. And when Richard confronted Barbara, expecting shock, anger, something, she defended Melinda. She's just being thorough, Barbara had said. Families shouldn't have secrets. That was the moment Richard stopped pretending. Leaving didn't make him brave overnight, but it made him honest. He started therapy, reconnected with people Barbara and Melinda had slowly pushed out of their lives over the years. Friends, relatives, anyone who'd questioned the family narrative. Barbara and Melinda closed ranks. They told people Richard was having a midlife crisis, that he'd been influenced by outsiders, that he'd come back once he realized how much damage he'd done. They painted Blake and me as the villains behind the scenes. We didn't respond. We didn't correct the record. We let the truth exist without defending it. And something unexpected happened. Peace. Without weekly dinners, without emotional ambushes, without the constant vigilance, our lives expanded. We spent time with people who respected boundaries. We laughed more. We slept better. Richard became a quiet presence in our lives, meeting Blake for lunch, checking in without expectations. He looked lighter, older maybe, but freer. Barbara's messages, when they came, were brief. Polite on the surface, hollow underneath. She never addressed what had happened, never apologized, never asked how we were doing. Melinda disappeared entirely. No messages, no attempts at reconciliation. We eventually crossed paths at a cousin's wedding. Barbara and Melinda arrived together, sat far away, left early. No confrontation, no drama. Just distance. And in that distance, clarity. They didn't miss us. They missed control. I realized then that the fallout wasn't about punishment. It was about consequences. When a system is built on denial, it can only survive as long as everyone participates. We stopped participating, and the system collapsed under its own weight. A year later, my life is quieter. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. Blake and I don't talk about Melinda anymore. Not because we're pretending nothing happened, but because she no longer occupies space in our daily lives. Her absence isn't dramatic. It's simply the natural result of boundaries finally being respected. We still see Richard. He's changed in subtle ways. He listens more. He apologizes when he's wrong. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, I can see the grief on his face for the years he spent protecting a system that harmed his own son. Barbara sends holiday messages now and then. Short, polite, carefully worded. She never asks why things are the way they are. I don't think she wants the answer. And that's okay. I've learned something important through all of this. Something I wish more people talked about. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Not every conflict has a satisfying apology. Sometimes healing comes from acceptance, not of what happened, but of who people are willing to be. Melinda showed us who she was repeatedly. Barbara showed us where her loyalty would always land. And Richard showed us that even after decades, change is possible if someone is willing to face the truth. Blake and I chose peace over proximity. We chose safety over appearances. We chose to stop shrinking. And in doing so, we found something I didn't realize I'd been missing for a long time, a sense of control over my own life. If there's one lesson I'd leave anyone watching this with, it's this. Boundaries aren't punishments, they're filters. They don't push good people away. They reveal who respects you enough to stay within them. We didn't lose a family. We gained clarity. And sometimes, that's the most healing ending of all.